Listen to me closely, because what I'm about to say will disturb your comfort, but awaken your calling. There is a sound in the spirit realm that no one else hears when a woman lies down in her bed alone at night. It is not the creaking of the mattress or the whisper of the wind outside the window. It is the sound of spiritual agreements being made, some by faith, some by fear. And what many women do not realize is that your solitude can either become a sanctuary for revelation or a stage for spiritual warfare. Sleeping alone is not your problem. It is what is happening in the realm of the unseen while you sleep that is dangerous. It is not about the absence of a body beside you. It is about the presence of unresolved emotions within you. Because the enemy does not fear your singleness. He fears your purpose. And if he can use your empty bed to convince you of an empty future, he will have already won the battle in your soul. But hear me, loneliness is not a location, it is a lie. It is a deceptive voice that sneaks in during the night and begins to speak. It says you are forgotten. It says you are unloved. It says you are incomplete. And if you do not answer that voice with truth, you will begin to believe that sleeping alone means being alone, and that belief becomes a stronghold. Every woman must learn the difference between solitude and spiritual vulnerability. Solitude is when you are alone with God. Vulnerability is when you are alone without him. And one of the greatest spiritual dangers is when a woman, especially a purpose-driven woman, starts making emotional agreements in the midnight hour that contradict her destiny. Let me tell you something. Your bed may be empty, but your calling is not. Your room may be quiet, but heaven is still speaking. Do not trade your divine season of refinement for the temporary relief of emotional distraction. The danger is not in sleeping alone. The danger is in forgetting who is watching over you while you sleep. Some women invite danger into their beds by letting their minds host thoughts they were never meant to entertain, imaginations, fantasies, regrets. These are spiritual portals. And when your emotions are not under spiritual authority, they become spiritual liabilities. You begin to crave what your flesh wants rather than what your spirit needs. You start interpreting your value based on who is not lying next to you instead of the God who never leaves you. Do you know what a woman truly becomes when she learns to sleep alone and still remain whole? Dangerous? Yes. Dangerous to the kingdom of darkness. Because she is no longer defined by touch, attention, or approval. She is not waiting to be chosen. She already knows she was appointed. If you're sleeping alone, don't spend the night rehearsing who left. Spend it in intimacy with the one who never did. Fill the silence with scripture. Fill the darkness with worship. Fill the space with purpose. Because where there is purpose, there is no vacancy for despair. The enemy wants to convince you that something is wrong with you, but I declare to you today, there is nothing wrong with you. There is something right about your future that hell is afraid of. That's why the attack came in the midnight hour. That's why your tears have been private. That's why you've been misunderstood, because you were never meant to be ordinary. Do not let your nights become agreements with despair. Make them altars of destiny. Build a life so rooted in God that any man who comes into your life must go through him to find you. Because when a woman sleeps alone but stands with God, no demon can invade her space, no lie can rule her mind, and no fear can dominate her spirit. Solitude is not weakness, it is a spiritual appointment. Many confuse being alone with being abandoned, but the two are not the same. In fact, the moments when a woman is most alone are often the very moments heaven leans in closest. When the noise of the world is silenced and the distractions of life are stripped away, the voice of God can finally be heard with clarity. Solitude is not punishment, it is preparation. It is the divine setup for encounters, instructions, and transformation. When a woman sleeps alone and begins to understand that her solitude is not a void, but a visitation, everything changes. She no longer dreads the silence, she embraces it. She no longer feels unworthy, she becomes aware of her worth. In solitude, you are not empty, you are being filled. You are not lost, you are being found in a new way. God isolates only those he intends to elevate. Think of every major biblical figure who was used mightily. Each had a moment of separation, a season of silence, a time where they were alone but not abandoned. The same is true for women today. When there is no one beside you, it is often because God is doing something within you. And if you rush to fill that space with another person, you may forfeit the power of what was meant to be deposited in your spirit. This spiritual appointment is sacred. It is a calling to come higher, to see clearer, to know deeper. Solitude reveals what companionship often conceals: your raw self, your true identity, and your unshakable connection with your Creator. It is in these moments of divine aloneness that purpose is awakened, assignments are revealed, and identity is fortified. Emotional isolation can attract spiritual vulnerability if not filled with purpose. When a woman feels emotionally disconnected, whether from people, affection, or meaningful companionship, there is a temptation to internalize that silence as abandonment. And that emotional gap, if left unguarded, becomes fertile ground for deception. The human heart was not designed to remain empty. It will always seek something to fill it. If not filled intentionally with purpose, vision, and spiritual truth, it will be filled unintentionally with lies, longing, and confusion. The danger of emotional isolation is not in being emotionally quiet, but in being spiritually empty. Emotions were designed by God to be indicators, not dictators. But when emotional hunger is not balanced by spiritual strength, a woman begins to interpret her worth based on what she feels instead of what she knows by faith. She may start to believe that her value decreases with the absence of love or attention, or that her silence is evidence of being forgotten. And in that belief, the enemy steps in, not always with chaos, but with whispers. You're not enough. You've been left behind. You are invisible. These whispers are not harmless thoughts. They are spiritual seeds. And if they are not uprooted by truth, they will grow into cycles of fear, compromise, and desperation. But emotional solitude is not meant to destroy you. It is meant to develop you. It is a divine opportunity to turn inward and upward, to discover not who is missing in your life, but what God is maturing in your heart. When your emotions are anchored in purpose, isolation loses its power. You stop seeing aloneness as a curse and start treating it as a classroom where God teaches, molds, and empowers you for something far greater than comfort, destiny. The absence of physical companionship must not become the breeding ground for soul dependency. A woman who finds herself without someone beside her physically, no partner to hold her, no spouse to share her bed, must be careful not to allow that external void to shape her internal identity. Companionship is a gift, but it was never meant to define the soul. When the heart begins to depend on physical presence for validation, it loses its ability to function from a place of spiritual authority. That's where the real danger begins. Not in the lack of human contact, but in the silent erosion of self-worth. Soul dependency is when your sense of identity, security, and emotional health becomes rooted in someone else's nearness. You begin to believe that your peace is tied to their presence, that your joy is dependent on their affection. But that is not the design of heaven. God never intended for another person to complete you. He intended for his spirit to sustain you. When a woman allows the absence of a person to create a hunger in her soul that only God was meant to fill, she opens the door to cycles of unhealthy attachments, emotional exhaustion, and spiritual compromise. You must be able to sit in a room alone and still feel full. You must be able to walk through seasons of singleness and not shrink in your value. If your soul becomes addicted to presence, it becomes weak in purpose. The enemy does not need to destroy you if he can distract you with longing. When your soul is anchored in God, companionship becomes a blessing, not a necessity for identity. The woman who learns to live whole without needing to be held is the woman who is most prepared to be entrusted with divine assignments. Women who sleep alone must guard their minds from subconscious agreements with loneliness. Loneliness is not always loud. Sometimes it is silent, creeping into the background of your thoughts and forming quiet contracts with your identity. These agreements don't shout, they whisper. They begin with thoughts like, maybe I'm not worthy. Maybe I'll always be alone. Or maybe something is wrong with me. These are not harmless musings. They are spiritual agreements made in moments of emotional fatigue. And once accepted, they shape how a woman prays, believes, and expects. The mind is the battlefield where the enemy sows seeds in the soil of solitude. A woman lying alone at night is not just experiencing a physical reality. She is being approached in the spiritual realm by ideas, suggestions, and subtle lies. And if she is not discerning, her heart will begin to agree with what her spirit was never meant to entertain. That is why the mind must be guarded, not just from the outside, but from the inside, from unspoken thoughts, unchallenged assumptions, and unhealed wounds. Subconscious agreements are dangerous because they feel like truth. They feel justified. They feel natural. But not everything that feels natural is spiritual. Not every emotion deserves affirmation. The danger of unchecked loneliness is that it creates a story in your mind where God is no longer central. You are. Pain becomes the author and feelings become the script. But you must take your thoughts captive. You must interrupt the narrative. Because if you let loneliness write your future, you will walk away from purpose for the comfort of proximity. Guard your mind with truth. Remind yourself that solitude is not absence, it is presence. The presence of clarity, the presence of preparation, the presence of the one who shapes destiny in silence. Spiritual attacks often masquerade as emotional needs unmet. The enemy does not always come with a roar. He often comes with a whisper that sounds like your own thoughts. One of his most effective strategies is to disguise spiritual warfare as emotional deficiency. A woman may feel neglected, unseen, unloved, and interpret that feeling as purely emotional, when in fact, it is a targeted spiritual strategy to weaken her resolve, distract her from purpose, and draw her away from divine alignment. But looks like sadness may actually be an invisible conflict for her identity. When emotional needs go unmet, the heart cries out for fulfillment. But if that cry is not directed toward God, it becomes vulnerable to counterfeit comforts. That's where the danger begins. A woman may begin to entertain thoughts, relationships, habits, or even fantasies that seem to soothe her temporarily, but actually expose her to spiritual compromise. The enemy is subtle. He doesn't destroy with explosions. He destroys with erosion. One small unmet need, left unguarded, becomes a portal for larger deception. When you feel a need rising inside, whether for affirmation, affection, or attention, you must ask yourself, is this truly emotional, or is this a spiritual moment requiring discernment? Not every longing must be filled by people. Some longings are sacred signals that your soul is craving divine intimacy. If you misinterpret these signals, you will reach for something that soothes the flesh but weakens the spirit. The woman who begins to recognize emotional vulnerability as a spiritual invitation becomes powerful. She learns to pray when others would panic. She learns to worship when others would waver. She replaces the craving for company with a hunger for communion with God. That shift doesn't just protect her. It transforms her into a vessel that hell can't manipulate and heaven can trust. A woman alone in her bed must fill the room with the presence of God, not the absence of man. What surrounds you in the stillness of the night will eventually shape what lives within you. When the physical absence of a man becomes the dominant atmosphere, the soul begins to magnify what is missing instead of who is present. That environment breeds longing, regret, doubt, and false identity. But when a woman chooses to intentionally fill her space with the presence of God through worship, prayer, the word, and holy expectation, everything shifts. The room is no longer a void. It becomes a temple. The presence of God is not a vague spiritual concept. It is a tangible atmosphere that transforms rooms, hearts, and destinies. It calms the restless heart, breaks the lies of loneliness, and renews the mind with truth. A woman who fills her nights with God's presence is not just surviving, she is building, she is preparing. She is aligning herself with divine timing. She understands that her value is not validated by who shares her bed, but by who sustains her spirit. Many women unknowingly worship the absence of man more than they worship the presence of God. They talk more about what they don't have than the one who never leaves. They rehearse old wounds more than they declare God's promises. That imbalance feeds despair and makes the heart susceptible to manipulation. But when God becomes the focus, clarity returns, identity is restored, and joy is awakened. You cannot control who walks in or out of your life, but you can absolutely control what presence fills your atmosphere. And when God fills the space, the emptiness flees, peace enters, strength rises, and you stop living for attention and start living from wholeness. The room doesn't need another body, it needs his spirit. The enemy targets isolation to inject deception about identity and worth. When a woman is isolated, physically alone, emotionally distant, or spiritually withdrawn, she becomes a prime target for subtle lies. The enemy knows that in moments of separation, the mind is most impressionable. It is in these quiet, unguarded spaces that he begins to whisper distortions. You're not enough. No one wants you. You're forgotten, or you missed your moment. These lies don't come as direct attacks. They come clothed in emotion, wrapped in memories, and justified by past pain. And if a woman is not rooted in truth, she will accept them as reality. Isolation is dangerous not because of the physical space, but because of what is allowed to grow in it. The enemy does not need an audience to begin warfare. He only needs access to your thought life. When a woman is alone and feels unseen, the battlefield becomes internal. Her thoughts begin to spiral. Her self-image begins to erode, and slowly she detaches from the confident, purpose-filled woman she once knew. She no longer dreams. She no longer believes. She starts to settle for survival instead of living with vision. But identity is not shaped in crowds. It is anchored in truth. A woman's worth is not determined by her surroundings, but by the one who created her. The enemy uses isolation to pull her away from this reality, to convince her that she is invisible and unnecessary. But the truth is, separation is often a setup for divine revelation. When a woman refuses to allow isolation to define her and instead uses it to deepen her connection with God, the enemy loses access. She no longer hears lies. She hears instructions. She no longer fears being alone. She embraces being hidden. Because what the enemy meant for disconnection, God always turns into preparation. Solitude is not a curse. It is a sacred season for divine revelation. Too often, solitude is viewed through the lens of punishment or rejection, as if being alone is evidence of something missing or broken. But in the realm of the spirit, solitude is one of the most powerful environments God uses to reveal himself and shape destiny. When everything around you becomes quiet and every distraction is removed, you begin to hear differently, see differently, and feel differently. The noise of the world fades, and what was once buried under activity and noise begins to rise to the surface. Your purpose, your wounds, your calling, your hidden strength. Some of the most anointed individuals in Scripture were led into solitude before they were ever released into public purpose. Moses had the desert, David had the wilderness, Jesus had the mountain. Solitude was not their downfall, it was their encounter, and the same is true today. When a woman finds herself alone, not by force but by divine orchestration, she must recognize the moment not as abandonment, but as invitation. God is drawing her away from the crowd to speak to her spirit. This sacred season is where foundations are rebuilt, where vision is sharpened, where insecurities are replaced with divine confidence. It is not a time to long for what was or fear what is to come. It is a time to lean in and ask, Lord, what are you saying to me here? Because in solitude, God does more than comfort. He reveals. He reveals hidden truths, buried callings, unseen battles, and untapped strength. A woman who embraces her solitude as sacred will come out of it with insight others missed, authority others lack, and clarity others still seek. What looks like isolation is often heaven's strategy for impartation. The spiritual danger is not the empty bed, but the empty soul. A woman can lay in a bed by herself every night and still be full of vision, peace, purpose, and joy. But when the soul becomes hollow, drained of meaning, detached from truth, and disconnected from God, that is when true danger sets in. The condition of the soul determines the direction of a woman's life. And while many focus on the physical absence of a partner, what truly matters is whether the inner life is filled with divine presence or consumed by emotional emptiness. An empty soul becomes vulnerable to anything that promises to fill it. Attention, validation, temporary relationships, or even addictions disguised as comfort. These are counterfeits, not cures. They mask the symptoms, but deepen the root problem: spiritual emptiness. A woman may appear strong, successful, and self-sufficient on the outside, but if her soul is malnourished, lacking prayer, truth, intimacy with God, she is exposed. And the enemy doesn't attack based on what's visible. He attacks based on what's vulnerable. The soul was created to carry purpose, not pain. It was made to house identity, not insecurity. And when a woman learns to nourish her soul through time in God's presence, meditation on His Word, and alignment with His will, the need for external validation diminishes. She is no longer driven by who is not in her life, but by who she is becoming in Christ. An empty bed doesn't define her. It frees her. But an empty soul will always cry out for what was never meant to fill it. The goal is not to fill your bed, it is to fill your soul. Because a full soul creates a life of overflow, where love, peace, and destiny flow from within, not from the temporary presence of another person. Leaping alone should not become a spiritual agreement with despair, but a covenant with destiny. There is a hidden danger when a woman begins to internalize her solitude as rejection, failure, or evidence that she is unworthy of love. The enemy thrives on convincing her that her current season is permanent, that the quiet in her room is proof that she is forgotten. But what many fail to realize is that the night is when God often makes the deepest deposit. It is not a moment of neglect. It is a sacred opportunity to enter into divine alignment. That bed is not just a resting place. It can become an altar. Despair is not just a feeling, it's an agreement. It happens when a woman begins to believe that nothing will change, that God is silent, and that her waiting has been wasted. But destiny also requires agreement. It requires a woman to wake up every day and say, this season has purpose. My waiting is not in vain. God is preparing something greater than I can see. The difference between despair and destiny lies in what you choose to believe in your solitude. Sleeping alone should not weaken your faith. It should strengthen your covenant. A covenant is not based on feelings. It is based on commitment. When you commit your nights to God, when you lay your head down and whisper promises back to heaven, when you resist the lies and stand on truth, you're not just passing time, you're preparing territory. You are declaring that your future is too valuable to be shaped by desperation. You're refusing to partner with the voice of lack and choosing to walk with the author of abundance. In that decision, you don't just survive the night, you set the stage for everything God has destined to unfold. Woman of purpose, your solitude is not your sentence, it is your sanctuary. What the world calls loneliness, heaven calls preparation. You are not less because you sleep alone. You are more dangerous to darkness because you've learned to walk with God when no one else was watching. Your value is not tied to who holds you at night, but to who holds your future. This season is not about waiting for someone to enter your life. It is about becoming the kind of woman who no longer waits to be chosen because she knows she was already appointed. Let this truth burn in your spirit. An empty bed is not a curse. It is the canvas where God paints your strength, your character, your vision, and your fire. The enemy fears the woman who has learned to lay in silence but rise with power. You don't need someone beside you to validate your worth. You carry the presence of the one who called you, shaped you, and set you apart. So rise from that bed, not with despair, but with destiny. Fill your room with worship. Fill your mind with truth. Fill your soul with purpose. Because when you walk in divine wholeness, you become a force that no man, no lie, and no devil can stop. You were not forgotten. You were hidden. Because what God hides, he plans to reveal in glory.